Shalom WJC family. It is time for our weekly Torah Talk. This week the Parsha is Parshat Toldot. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I want to share the sermon that I gave in Shul last Saturday for Parshat Chayei Sarah. It actually happened to deal with issues in Chayei Sarah and Toldot, and I think this drush is important enough that it's worth making sure that we share it again. So one of the lingering questions about our patriarchs involves Yitzchak, or Isaac. As a patriarch, one of our primary ancestors who sets the Jewish people on our eternal path, he is enigmatic at best. Yitzchak lacks agency. Unlike Abraham and Jacob, or even Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, because our matriarchs certainly have as much of a role of placing the Jewish people on our path, compared to them, Yitzchak has barely a story of his own. He is regularly acted upon, but rarely acts for his own concern. One of the prime examples of that is what we read in last week's Parsha Chayei Sarah, when Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to Aram Naharaim to find a wife for Isaac. We are left wondering, why isn't Isaac able to go find his own wife? And it's not like this is happening all the time. We don't see other examples of servants being sent to play matchmaker. So what's going on here with Yitzchak? There are rabbis who do address this question, like the Ramban, Nachmanides, who explains that one of the patriarchs needs to live his whole life in the promised land, and thus to establish Jewish ownership rights of that land. Still, other commentators just ignore the strange request that Abraham sets before his servant. But I don't want to ignore it, because this question, combined with the subsequent events of Isaac's life that we'll read about in this week's portion, Toldot, can't help but leave us with questions about Yitzchak's abilities. For example, in this week's Parsha, we will read about Yaakov, Jacob, who, at his mother Rivka's behest, tricks Yitzchak. Jacob disguises himself as Esau in order to steal his brother's blessing. Right, we know the story maybe. He takes sheepskin and puts it on himself so he'll feel like Esau. It doesn't seem like a ruse that would work in many contexts, except it does in this one. Because the Torah, as the Torah describes it, Isaac's eyes are dim. But what is this dimness of the eyes all about? The text makes it sound like he's on his deathbed, like he's an old man, but in fact, he lives for decades beyond this episode. We know that Jacob, after all this, is going to flee, and when he flees, he's going to be gone for a couple of decades, and he comes back, and only then do we hear about Yitzchak's death. So, 20 plus years is a little too long for a deathbed scene. So we're left to wonder, what is wrong with Yitzchak? Why are his eyes dim? One line of interpretation goes all the way back to the Akedah, to what we call the binding of Isaac. You may remember the story. We read it on Rosh Hashanah. But it also happened to be just at the end of the last Parsha we read, Parshat Vayera. As you may recall, in that story, God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, which Abraham comes very close to doing. He gets all the way to holding a knife, a big knife, a ma'achelet, a consuming knife over his son. And at the last minute, he's stopped by an angel who calls to him, Avraham, Avraham. One midrash in Genesis Rabbah, in commenting on Isaac's dim eyes, in our Parsha, Toldot says, when Isaac was bound upon the altar and his father was about to slay him, at that very moment, the heavens opened and the ministering angels saw what was going on and they wept. and their tears flowed and fell upon Isaac's eyes, which thus became dim. Oh, a heartbreaking scene. Right? In other words, after the episode of his father standing over him with a knife, obviously prepared to kill him, Yitzchak was never the same. How could he be? The relationship with Avraham is broken. They never speak again in the Torah. And maybe worse than that, Isaac's relationship with God seems to be broken as well. Later, Jacob will describe his God, will describe God to someone, and he'll refer to him as Elohei Avraham Pachad Yitzchak. Right, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. What is this all about? It seems that Yitzchak's experience as a young man left him in fear his whole life. In fact, another midrash on the story of the stolen blessing in this week's Parshat Toldot expands on this idea. After Jacob runs off with his blessing, Esau comes back. He's got his fresh kill that he prepared in Jacob's favorite stew, right? He's coming to get the blessing that Jacob just got. And he walks in, he says, "Dad, I'm here. I've got our stew. Let's eat, and you'll give me a nice blessing." And when Yitzchak realizes what's happened, the text describes Yitzchak feared a great fear. In the Midrash, Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina comes along and says, how much of a fear? Even greater than the fear he feared on the altar. In other words, this fear of God had stayed with him since the altar, right? Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina makes that connection to this fear that has pervaded all of Yitzchak's life. And not only that, it's grown as he's aged. The fear is worse because he feared a great fear. It helps explain Yitzchak's frailty as well. Midrash Tanchuma explains that there are 4 possible causes of premature old age. One is because the person lives in fear of something. By the way, as an aside, the other 3 are very interesting. It's because he's angry with his children. It's interesting. Because he's married to an evil person, God forbid. And 4, because of being involved in waging wars. And it seems to me that we've seen a lot of that premature aging from experience of wars of late. Anyway, Yitzchak lives with a constant fear, and it's broken his relationship with his father. It's broken his relationship with God. No wonder he's such a mess at the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah when his mother dies. Sarah was his only trusted connection to this world. Right? If you have no relation with your father, if you can't connect to God, mom becomes awfully important. In fact, when interpreting the scene at the end of Chayei Sarah, at the end of last week's portion, where Rivka sees Isaac from afar, the Midrash professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Bert Vizatsky, describes Isaac as being out in the field urinating. That's probably not how you've heard the story before. It doesn't paint Isaac with the respect that we want him to have, but, says Dr. Vizatsky, the Semitic root of lasuach can mean urinate. Right? Rivka comes home after this whole bargain, and Isaac went out to relieve himself. That's what Dr. Vizatsky says. But I want to take it even a step further than that. Let's really re-examine what's happening here. Isaac is wandering in the fields. His mom is gone. He's lost, that relationship with his mom that anchored him to reality, that allowed him to live in this world. And now, with her gone, he's having a complete collapse. So far gone is he in his break that he's lost control of his bodily functions. He's hit rock bottom. He's lost control of his basic humanity, or at least connection to it. Rivka sees him and falls off the animal she's riding. That's what the text says. We think she fell for him in love, but maybe it's out of shock at his condition. A handsome man, an important, wealthy man, but on the edge. But maybe Rivka, whose kindness is proved in the story at the well, when Eliezer's looking for a woman who'll water his camels. Maybe she's exactly the one that Yitzchak needs. And the text says that Yitzchak is comforted by her presence as he was comforted by his mother Sarah. Rivka is just the type of person to nurse her infirmed husband back to health. So remember, this is only one midrash, one interpretation of the story, but I think it's an important one. It's one explanation for Yitzchak's strange lack of agency. It's that he suffered a trauma so great at the Akedah that he was never the same. He suffered from what we might call today post-traumatic stress disorder. But we shouldn't confuse lack of agency with lack of purpose. This does not delegitimize Yitzchak's role as an important part of the story of the Jewish people. In fact, if his illness developed from trauma, as the Midrash implies, then he may be the patriarch we relate to the most. I mean, is there any other people who has survived as much trauma as the Jewish people? We are Yitzchak. Life comes with trauma. Mental health is real health, and Yitzchak reminds us of the importance of honoring and accepting those who are sick in this way, just as much as those who are suffering physical illness. They are still valuable. They still have a role to play. They are still an important part of our story. In fact, I would challenge a little if you are uncomfortable or even find it offensive to hear me speak about one of our patriarchs as mentally ill, even as a midrash, as just one possibility of what was going on here. I encourage you to ask yourself, why? What does that say about our cultural stigma around mental illness? Would it offend you if a patriarch had terminal cancer or macular degeneration to explain his dim eyes? Then why is it offensive? Why are we shocked to talk about a patriarch with terminal depression or PTSD? Knowing what we know now about mental illness, I don't think we should be judging those with this disease. In fact, understanding how difficult and painful every day was for Yitzchak, and yet he was able to serve such an essential role in Judaism's origins, may make his life even more impressive, not less. It is up to us to remember Yitzchak, not for his fear, but for his role as a link in the chain of the Jewish people, despite his fractured relationship with God and his father. I find that comforting. I wanted to share these thoughts about Yitzchak not only because my own family has paid the terrible price of mental illness gone unchecked, but also because we are all paying that price. This is a difficult moment in the life of our society when it comes to mental health and depression. Nationally, more than 47 million adults are experiencing mental illness. That's a 19% of the national population. The estimated number of adults with serious suicidal thoughts is over 10.7 million, an increase of over 460,000 people from last year's data set. In 2021, 13.84% of youth ages 12 to 17 report suffering from at least one major depressive episode, an MDE as they're called, in the past year. Childhood depression is more likely to persist into adulthood if gone untreated. Just look at Yitzchak. The Bible knew this 3,500 years ago. The number of youth at that risk, the number of youth experiencing MDE, increased by 206,000 from last year's data set. There can be no doubt this is a national mental health crisis. And the sad thing is that while there is no guaranteed cure for many of these ailments, there are so many ways to treat them that weren't available even a few years ago. But the stigma remains, and so many people go untreated until it is too late. Not to mention that mental health services are woefully underfunded in this country in general. That's why Tammy and I wanted to be honest and open about how mental health has been a struggle in our family, And it is why I believe we can and should look at all the aspects of Yitzchak's story and all our biblical progenitors. They were real people with real issues, and we should expect no less from ourselves. We can have issues and still accomplish the mission God meant for us in the world, just like Yitzchak, just like the rest of our biblical ancestors. That is what makes them great, and what makes us potentially great. Not perfection, but getting through our flaws and moving forward with God's purpose anyway. So let's have some honest conversations about mental health. And please know that if you have questions or doubts or need support, we are here for you. Reach out and we will do our best to help you or someone who you are worried about find the help that you need or they need. In honor of our family members who struggled with mental health issues, Tammy and I will also be supporting the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the National Alliance for Mental Health. We invite you to join us in supporting those who are supporting us all as we face the other pandemic, the pandemic that nobody is talking about, that few people are talking about, the mental health crisis that is claiming so many lives in our country right now, spreading virulently across the nation. Let us do our part to hold that pandemic in check, just like the COVID-19 pandemic.